In 1337, a dispute over a single crown ignited one of the longest wars in human history. It would last not 10 years, not 20, but 116 years. Generations would be born, fight, and die without ever seeing peace. Entire regions would be devastated. Kings would rise and fall. And by the time it ended, England and France would never be the same again. Today, we call it the 100 Years' War. But despite its name, it was not one continuous battle. It was a series of campaigns, truces, invasions, and civil conflicts that stretched across more than a century. To understand how it began, we must first understand one family. The Castillon dynasty had ruled France for over 300 years. 4 generations, the succession passed smoothly from father to son. Then, in the early 14th century, disaster struck. Within a short period, 3 French kings, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV, all died without leaving a surviving male heir. For the first time in centuries, France faced a succession crisis. Who had the rightful claim to the throne? One candidate was Philip of Valois, a cousin of the deceased king. The French nobility supported him, arguing that the crown could not pass through the female line, a principle later associated with the Salic law. Philip became King Philip VI of France. But another man believed the throne belonged to him. Across the English Channel ruled King Edward III of England. Edward's mother, Isabella, was the sister of Charles IV, making Edward the grandson of a French king. From Edward's perspective, that gave him a legitimate claim to the French crown. The French nobles disagreed. They rejected Edward's claim and recognized Philip VI instead. At first, the disagreement remained political. Neither king immediately sought total war. But relations between England and France had been tense for years. English kings still controlled territories in southwestern France, particularly the rich region of Gascony. Although these lands belonged to the English crown, they were technically held as fiefs of the French king. This created a constant source of conflict. Every disagreement over taxes, trade, or local authority threatened to become an international crisis. Then came another important factor: Flanders. The wealthy cities of Flanders depended on English wool to support their thriving textile industry. Both England and France wanted influence over this economically vital region. Trade and politics became inseparable. As tensions grew, diplomacy slowly gave way to confrontation. Finally, in 1337, King Philip VI declared that Edward III had violated his obligations as a vassal and confiscated the English-held Duchy of Gascony. For Edward, this was more than the loss of territory. It was a direct challenge to his authority. In response, he formally renewed his claim to the French throne. The dispute was no longer about a single province. It had become a struggle over who had the right to rule France itself. Neither king could have imagined what would follow. Both expected a campaign measured in months, perhaps a few years. Instead, they had unleashed a conflict that would outlive them, their sons, and even their grandsons. A war that would transform medieval Europe forever. And before long, England would achieve a victory so unexpected that the balance of power in Europe would be shaken to its core. When the war began, few believed England could defeat France. France had a much larger population, greater wealth, and one of the strongest armies in medieval Europe. Its knights were feared across the continent. Victory seemed inevitable. But the English possessed something that would change medieval warfare forever: the longbow. Unlike the crossbow, the English longbow could fire rapidly over long distances in the hands of a well-trained archer. An experienced bowman could release multiple arrows before an enemy even reached striking distance. Against heavily armored knights, that advantage would prove devastating. The first great turning point came in 1346 at the Battle of Crécy. King Edward III faced a much larger French army led by Philip VI. Confident in their superiority, the French launched repeated cavalry charges. Again and again, the knights advanced. Again and again, they were met by thousands of arrows. The muddy battlefield slowed the horses. Armor offered little protection against the relentless storm of arrows. By the end of the battle, the French army had collapsed. Crécy shocked all of Europe. For centuries, armored knights had dominated medieval battlefields. Now, disciplined infantry and skilled archers had proven they could defeat them. England's victories did not end there. In 1347, Edward captured the strategic port of Calais after an 11-month siege. The city became England's most important foothold in France and remained under English control for more than 2 centuries. A decade later came another crushing blow. At the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, Edward's son, better known as the Black Prince, faced another larger French force. Once again, the English army emerged victorious. Even more astonishing, King John II of France was captured alive during the battle. The capture of a reigning king was almost unimaginable. France was thrown into political and economic chaos. To secure his release, enormous sums were demanded, placing an immense burden on the French crown. By the end of the 1350s, England appeared unstoppable. Many believed the war was already decided. But history rarely follows a straight path. While England celebrated its victories, a far deadlier enemy arrived. Not an army, not a king, but a disease that would kill millions across Europe. And when the war resumed, both kingdoms would face a very different future. By the late 14th century, the war had slowed. Years of fighting had exhausted both kingdoms. Then came another disaster. The Black Death swept across Europe, killing millions and crippling economies on both sides of the English Channel. For a time, the conflict faded into the background. But peace never truly arrived. In 1415, a new English king revived the war. His name was Henry V. Young, ambitious, and an exceptional military commander, Henry believed he could succeed where earlier kings had failed. He claimed the French crown and crossed the Channel with an army determined to force France into submission. At first, the campaign seemed uncertain. Disease had weakened the English army during the siege of Harfleur, and thousands of soldiers were no longer fit to fight. Outnumbered and exhausted, Henry decided to march toward the English-held port of Calais. The French saw their chance. A massive army moved to block his path near the village of Agincourt. On October 25, 1415, the two forces met. The French army outnumbered the English by at least 2 to 1. Many French nobles expected an easy victory. Instead, they repeated the mistakes made at Crécy and Poitiers. Heavy rain had turned the freshly ploughed fields into thick mud. As French knights advanced, their armor became a burden. They struggled to move. Horses slipped. Soldiers crowded together with little room to maneuver. Waiting for them were thousands of English longbowmen. Arrow after arrow filled the sky. The advancing French formations slowed, then collapsed into confusion. When the survivors finally reached the English line, they were exhausted and trapped in the mud. Henry's soldiers counterattacked. By the end of the day, thousands of French nobles and knights lay dead. Agincourt became one of the most famous victories in English military history. The defeat shook France to its core. But the kingdom's greatest crisis was still ahead. At the same time, France was being torn apart by a bitter civil war between two powerful factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Instead of uniting against England, the French were fighting one another. Henry V seized the opportunity. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes declared Henry the heir to the French throne and recognized him as the future king of both England and France. It was an astonishing political victory. For the first time, it seemed entirely possible that France would disappear as an independent kingdom. Yet history was about to take an extraordinary turn. At the very moment France appeared defeated, a young peasant girl claimed she had been sent by God to save her country. Her name was Joan of Arc. By 1428, France stood on the edge of collapse. Much of northern France was under English control. Paris had been lost. The Treaty of Troyes had recognized the English king as heir to the French throne. The man who should have become King Charles VII had been declared illegitimate by his enemies. Many believed France would soon disappear. Then, an unlikely figure emerged. She was not a noble. She was not a soldier. She was a 17-year-old peasant girl from the village of Domremy. Her name was Joan of Arc. Joan claimed that since childhood she had received visions from Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. According to her, these voices had given her a single mission: save France and lead Charles to his coronation. To many, her story sounded impossible. Yet after meeting Charles, Joan somehow convinced the royal court to trust her. She was given armor, a banner, and permission to accompany the French army. Her destination was the city of Orleans. 4 months, English forces had surrounded the city. If Orleans fell, southern France would likely follow. The siege had become the turning point of the entire war. In April 1429, Joan entered the city. Although experienced commanders directed military operations, Joan's courage and unwavering belief inspired soldiers whose morale had nearly collapsed. Within days, French forces launched a series of determined attacks against the English fortifications. One by one, the English positions fell. On May 8, 1429, the siege was lifted. For the first time in years, France had achieved a major victory. The psychological impact was enormous. Joan became a symbol of hope. The impossible suddenly seemed possible. Only weeks later, the French army continued its advance, clearing the road to the city of Reims. There, in July 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France. For many French people, Joan had fulfilled the mission she claimed God had given her. But her story was far from over. In 1430, while defending the town of Compiègne, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces, who were allied with England. Instead of treating her as a prisoner of war, they handed her over to the English. She was placed on trial for heresy. The proceedings were as political as they were religious. After months of interrogation, Joan was found guilty. On May 30th, 1431, at just 19 years old, she was burned at the stake in Rouen. The English believed her death would destroy French resistance. Instead, it achieved the opposite. Joan of Arc became a martyr. Her death united France more than her victories ever had. The war was no longer simply a struggle between two kings. It had become a fight for the survival of a nation, and England's greatest victories were about to unravel. Joan of Arc was dead, but the war was far from over. If anything, her death marked the beginning of France's recovery. King Charles VII understood that inspiration alone would not defeat England. France needed something it had lacked for decades: a permanent, professional army. Rather than relying entirely on feudal nobles and temporary levies, Charles began reorganizing the kingdom's military. Royal authority grew stronger, taxes became more centralized, and for the first time, France could maintain standing forces that answered directly to the crown. At the same time, a new weapon was changing warfare forever: gunpowder artillery. Cannons had appeared earlier in the war, but by the mid-15th century they had become far more effective. The towering stone castles that had dominated medieval Europe for centuries were no longer invincible. Walls that once resisted months of siege could now be shattered by concentrated cannon fire. The age of the armored knight was slowly coming to an end. The age of gunpowder had begun. As French armies advanced, England's territories steadily disappeared. One by one, cities that had flown the English banner for generations returned to French control. Then came the final battle. On July 17, 1453, French and English forces met at the Battle of Castillon. Unlike the famous cavalry battles of the early war, Castillon was dominated by artillery. The English launched repeated attacks against well-prepared French positions. Cannons tore through advancing formations. The English commander, the legendary John Talbot, was killed during the fighting. His death shattered English resistance. The battle ended in a decisive French victory. Soon afterward, England lost Gascony, its last major possession in southwestern France. Only the port of Calais remained under English control, and even that would eventually be lost a century later. After 116 years, the Hundred Years' War had finally ended. But its greatest legacy was not who won. It was what the war created. Before the conflict, loyalty was often directed toward local lords or noble families. By the end of the war, something new had emerged: a stronger sense of national identity. People increasingly thought of themselves as English or French, not simply as subjects of a feudal lord. The war also transformed military history. Masked longbowmen had challenged the dominance of heavily armored knights. Professional armies replaced temporary feudal forces, and artillery forever changed the design of castles, fortifications, and battlefields. The medieval world was giving way to a new era. Looking back, the Hundred Years' War was never truly about one disputed crown. It became a struggle that reshaped two kingdoms, transformed European warfare, and helped define the future of England and France. Ironically, neither Edward III nor Philip VI lived to see the end of the conflict they had begun. Generations fought after them. Generations died after them. Yet when the war finally ended, Europe was no longer the same. The Hundred Years' War did not simply change history. It marked the end of one age and the beginning of another.